this session. My name is Tea Paulovic. I've acted as the coordinator on this roadmap for more welfare roadmap, as we call it. And I have the pleasure to kickstart our presentation today. So the consortium we have 40 minutes today to present to you the methodology that we employed to implement this roadmap and some of the findings of the roadmap. 40 minutes is not enough to show you all the work that we've done in the past year, but fear not, tomorrow the report will be published. So this acts as a teaser in a way, and you will be able to see all of the findings once the report is out tomorrow. So perhaps to say a few words, you've already heard the background. For us, the beginning is in 2022 when EFSA published a theme concept paper for their more welfare project, which seeks at the end of the day to enable EFSA. It outlined the objectives which would enable EFSA to meet its twofold vision, as we heard, on the one hand, to be able to develop new methodologies for assessing animal welfare risks, and on the other hand, for collecting standardized and good quality data. Now, as a next step in before actually starting with this project, they launched a call for tender for development of a roadmap for action. And this is where we had stepped in. And perhaps to tell you just a few words on the objectives of this roadmap for action. A roadmap in itself is a strategic planning document that seeks to give a current state of play on an issue. In this case, it's animal welfare. And it also seeks to then enable a prioritization strategy by which one can close certain developmental research gaps that exist or barriers and so on. You can see here on the screen, we've listed the objectives that we had for our roadmap. So what we aimed to do was initially map any ongoing or planned developments in animal welfare assessment. And by doing so, this would enable us to identify also certain existing data or knowledge gaps and any challenges that exist or barriers that exist to closing those gaps. This allowed us to identify developmental research areas, or what we've coined as working areas, and you will later hear a bit more on these and what these are. At the end of the day, all this mapping and identification of gaps, of challenges, of also collaboration opportunities has enabled us to give a prioritization on strategies and actions that EFSA should implement in the coming future to be able to, at the end of the day, reach its vision. Now, we've mentioned the consortium. It's important also to show that besides, the core project team that was Ecoris Wageningen Livestock Research, the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and Oread Brecht, we also had a pool of experts that joined us, and that ensured that we didn't miss anything from the specific species perspective. You will see later on that our scope of work was very broad and we covered a lot of different species. So we were joined as well by experts from the University of Padova, University of Bologna, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. We had the French IFIP Institute, the French agency ANSES, and two more researchers from Wageningen University. So large consortium, and a big thank you to all of them as well for their dedicated work on this roadmap. Just a word on the scope of the work. I said we covered a broad range of animal species. You can see them here listed. What is important to say as well is that our roadmap focused on-farm welfare. So we did not cover with our research activities, transport and slaughter. Very, very wide variety of animal species, and thus we had many experts on board. This is my last slide before I give the word to my colleagues to present the actual findings then. And just before diving into those, it's worth to give you a bit of an overview of the approach that we had to implementing this roadmap, so the methodology of the roadmap. There's a lot of boxes here. We're moving from top to bottom and left to right. Essentially, I'll try to just say a few words on the activities that we employed and the outputs that we got. So we started our project with mapping ongoing developments in animal welfare. And we did this through, on the one hand side, literature review, and on the other hand, desk research. The aim of the literature review was to basically screen existing scientific literature. And we wanted to get a state of play on the application of welfare assessment protocols. So we ended up screening at the end more than 9,000 scientific papers. With the desk research, we aimed to map any other relevant activities, meaning activities that related to animal welfare. And we identified 4 types of activities that would be of relevance for this project. So we mapped for research projects and operational groups. On the other hand, certifications and labeling schemes. We screened as well enforcement activities, and lastly, any thematic networks. And here as well, we ended up with a lot of information and with more than 5,000 entries in our database. So the literature review and the desk research already gave us a very good base for identifying the states of play and seeing where any gaps or challenges exist. In addition to this, we also conducted stakeholder consultation activities. It's good to mention that we had in total 3 virtual workshops. And with each workshop, we had about 80 participants, so 80 animal welfare experts that kept on joining us each time. And a big thank you to those. Some might even be joining us today. And so the literature review, the desk research, and these workshops all together helped us to identify existing gaps, existing challenges, and then to fully define working areas or develop fields where more research is needed. Examples include, for instance, positive welfare or ways of identifying thresholds. You can see them here on the screen. You will hear more about them in a few minutes. Once those were identified, the team internally processed those and came with 10 project proposals. So we formulated project proposals that would, once implemented, help to enhance the state of research in those fields and close any existing gaps. With these proposals that the consortium formulated, we came to a final workshop with experts, which then served as a verification method, but also as a means of prioritizing these 10 project proposals. Upon some further then analysis, we merged some proposals. We discussed this thoroughly with EFSA, and at the last line that you can see here on the screen is the final outcome of the roadmap, and it's 5 project proposals. These are intended to be multi-partner, multi-year projects that hopefully at some point in the near future will get implemented. There were many more suggestions. These are as well included in the roadmap. And what is also important to say is that we had as well a consultation activity and online survey that also contributed in identifying these gaps, and it complemented as well all other research. So that's that much for the methodology itself. What we will aim to present to you today is firstly finding some of the main takeaways from the literature review and the desk research. My colleagues Ingrid and Gerard will tell you a few words on those. We will then move on to the main findings from our work on the working areas, or rather the gaps and the challenges. My colleague Paul will give us an overview of those. And we will end with the presentation of the 5 project proposals that are the result of our roadmap. And this will be presented by Hans. And not to spend more time on this, I will now pass the word to Ingrid, who will start with the literature review.
Yes, thank you, Thea. Thank you very much. I will briefly give an overview of some of the main outcomes of the review of the scientific literature with respect to the application of welfare assessment protocols under commercial conditions. And this covered the previous 10 years of in which literature has been published. This table summarizes the outcomes. You can see on the second line the number of papers per species that have been found. And on the first line, you can see the total number of indicators that has been extracted from all the papers. Indicators can have been applied multiple times in several papers. So you also see for the different domains, the total number of unique, so different indicators that have been extracted. If you click, please, Thea. You can see that we found most papers for dairy cattle, farm most papers, and also most indicators. But for example, also for pigs, while we found considerably less papers as compared to dairy cattle, we found a considerable amount of indicators that has been extracted. For insects, we didn't find any papers at all, but for example, for fish, there were also a small number of papers found. And this is also valid for example, turkey, ducks, geese, and quail, and rabbits. If you go to the next slide, we there summarize per domain, so behavior, environment, health, mental state, and nutrition, the total number of entries and the number of unique indicators. And it's clear from this that for the health domain, we found the largest number of indicators, so total entries, as well as the largest number of unique indicators, while the least numbers were found for the mental state domain and also for the behavior domain. So if you go to the next slide, please. We also classified the indicators as being either animal-based or resource-based, management-based, or environment-based. And for the health domain, it was very clear that most indicators that have been extracted were animal-based. And this was also valid for the behavior domain and also for the mental state domain. So for these 3 domains, animal-based measures were most prevalent. Then if you go to the next slide, you will see that for the environment domain, in contrast, we found quite a lot of resource-based and management-based indicators. And this is also the case for the nutrition domain. So here, for the environment and nutrition domain, resource and management-based indicators were most prevalent, while animal-based indicators were lacking or very scarce. Next slide, please. Gerard, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can listen me correctly. And I'm pleased to explain you the principal findings on the desk research, but also at the end, I will explain common conclusions that we share with the literature review and try to link it already with some of the working areas. So this research was done in parallel with the literature review and focused on mapping mainly these 3 groups of activities. The first group included development activities, and within we find research projects and operational groups. These projects had to be active at least from late 2019, yes, and to now. Gaps were already identified here for several species. As an example, only 1 project was found for rabbits, or a total absence of developments for insects other than honeybees. On the other hand, precision livestock farming, from now PLF, is a major focus of development, as more than 30% of these activities are related with their use in development and development. A second group of activities included labeling and certification schemes, but also enforcement activities. And we named that current animal welfare assessment, or CAWA, from now. They are all ongoing activities, no matter the date of beginning. Ruminants, pigs, chickens, including broilers and laying hens, and salmonids showed a high variety of protocols, while for the rest of the species was more limited, or even absent in some cases. Finally, we also mapped thematic networks, as they can be relevant for collaboration opportunities, but we didn't analyze any of the data collected in terms of indicators, as this was not their focus. Next slide, please. Here we represent in this slide some graphs, as you can see. And what we did here is for development activities and CAWA, and current animal welfare assessment, the welfare indicators were extracted and compared. The pie charts show this comparison per domains in terms of frequency per each of the domains. And it can be noted the low proportion of indicators associated with mental state in gray for CAWA. This is in contrast with the development activities where mental state is quite predominant. The histograms below in the left side and the right side show the proportion of resource, management, and animal-based indicators extracted per domain in orange, blue, and yellow, respectively. Development activities, the graph in the left, focus on the setting up and application of animal-based measures. On the contrary, CAWA, or current animal welfare assessment, focus on indicators for hazards, resources, and management. Next slide, please. Finally, there's a high diversity of protocols used for labeling, certification schemes, but also enforcement. The figure on your left shows these differences regarding the manner that these schemes aggregate indicators. Almost half of them do not aggregate indicators, but ask for accomplishment of oral criteria. About 35% of them combine pass-fail standards or knockout with a percentage, weight or not, of accomplishment for other criteria. Finally, 4 labels include welfare quality or AWIN systems for the aggregation of indicators. 20% of these schemes also allow classification of farms in multi-tier systems from a lower to higher level welfare of welfare. In the graph in your right, you can see the classification of the schemes based on their ABM collection system. Half of them had as focus the inclusion of on-farm collected ABMs, animal-based measures, when 20% of them focused their collection at the slaughter. Finally, there's a 20% that only was focused or mostly was focused on resources and management criteria, so no ABM were collected. Next slide, please. In these slides, we will summarize the principal findings in relation to working areas identified in this roadmap from literature review and desk research. Firstly, 7 working areas were identified and further classified in 3 blocks. The first block included 2 working areas related with the definition of welfare. Firstly, conceptualization of welfare, including notions from other disciplines, for example, methods from human psychology, sociology, or neurology, among others. And the second working area here was related on positive animal welfare, which include activities or scientific works that use or develop indicators for positive emotions or behaviors. Examples of it, play behavior or some specific body postures. It was found that behavioral indicators and mental state are areas clearly under development, especially for dairy cows, pigs, laying hens, and horses, but it is a clear gap for other species. Also, we don't know how much feasible is this knowledge when applying it in current assessment protocols, which links to the next 2 blocks. Next, please. The second block is related to the development and aggregation of indicators and the development of new tools for animal welfare assessment. 3 working areas were identified here. The first one include research or activities that aim to identify thresholds and cutoffs for determining where a welfare problem starts to occur. The second working area relates on how individual animal welfare measures can be aggregated for a final overall score. Welfare quality and AWIN protocols could be a good example of it. And finally, the third is related to the development of new tools for monitoring early warning systems. Here, development related with precision livestock farming could be included. The principal finding was the lack of standardization and harmonization, both at indicator and at protocol level. As mentioned previously, PLF is an area of increasing interest, but there's a need on the information on their validation and applicability in the field too. Next slide, please. And finally, the third block was related with more advanced frameworks for animal welfare assessment. Here, we find two working areas. The first one focuses on the comparison and grading of farms, for example, multi-tier systems in some labeling schemes for consumers, as mentioned before. The second is related with the development of frameworks or tools that can be useful for decision-making for policymakers. For example, determining iceberg indicators or monitoring systems that may help to prioritize welfare measures. In the literature, clear gaps were found for dairy calves, poultry other than laying hens, fish and crustaceans, and insects. These agreed with the findings in development activities, with the exception of salmon and broilers that were quite well represented. In current animal welfare assessment, a clear gap was found for horses meant for meat production, where no specific assessment protocols were found. Finally, as mentioned earlier, these frameworks need to integrate behavioral indicators and positive emotion, but also to include key ABMs, animal-based measures, especially for nutrition and environment domains, and in a valid and feasible way. Again, PLF opened a powerful opportunity here. And that's all what we wanted to explain you regarding the state of play. Now, Paul will explain findings per working area. The floor is yours, Paul.
Thank you, Gerard. And I will continue with the next slide, which is basically a scheme defining the different blocks that Gerard just mentioned. And considering these 7 working areas that we took from that were already designed by EFSA in the concept paper that EFSA Tia mentioned in the beginning, we took these 7 working areas in order to consult experts using these workshops and see what are the main gaps and challenges that would apply for each working area. Let's have a look on each working area. Next slide. We found some general gaps or issues that were common in different species, so that we gather them all now in this slide. For pigs, ruminants, and poultry, there are a growing number of issues related with trade-offs with other aspects than animal welfare. For instance, environmental sustainability. In pigs and poultry, there are a diversity of husbandry systems and categories of animals, for instance, different production stages. In small ruminants and rabbits, there is a lack of sufficient basic knowledge due to a lack of investment on research activities. Long lifespan and generation intervals and lack of traceability for some species that are quite or have a long longevity, for instance, cattle and horses. And then for insects and fish, there are environmental effects that will have a strong impact on them, and some habitats makes the assessment complex, for instance, in wild fish. Also, it's common between these 2 groups that a great diversity of species, sometimes which is huge, with a very different biological needs. Next slide. In the first working area, which is the conceptualization of animal welfare and notions from other disciplines, we found the lowest number of mapped activities. So very few activities were spotted addressing this specific working area. Some of the main knowledge gaps were that integrating concepts from various scientific disciplines, including human psychology, sociology, anthropology, and others, should be somehow or are still lacking when applied to animal welfare. This poses a challenge, which is this necessity of interdisciplinary collaboration between all these scientific disciplines. As the main knowledge gaps, there are no methodologies assessing mood and the concept of flow state. This is how was it referred to, and need validation and technological adaptation. An example here would be to use technological devices or methodologies that have been validated in human psychology, for instance, the grimace scale, in order to assess or to define welfare. There is a challenge is the training and knowledge exchange between specialists and experts from these different disciplines. There are also gaps in the understanding of emotions, and that in the investigation of this understanding, there is a challenge, which is to avoid an anthropomorphic view when addressing it. Next slide. In the second working area, which addressed positive animal welfare, we found a bigger number of activities mapped because, as already mentioned by Gerard, is a welfare area in development. We found that pigs, dairy cows, and poultry are the species receiving the higher number of activities, whereas other species, this is still in its infancy. Some major knowledge gaps is a lack of a consensus in the definition of positive welfare, and that is itself a challenge. So this needs to be addressed, and there are already some research projects addressing this aspect, namely the lift cost action that gathers experts in the field. Other knowledge gaps are the animals' biological needs in different conditions, which may vary the way animals perceive their environment, and to find valid indicators and their use in existing protocols. Also, it's a notable gap how animals how animals aggregate positive and negative experiences, looking for a balance between positive and negative welfare. So for this, a challenge and perhaps a route to address them is multidisciplinary collaboration between different expertises. Next slide. In the third working area, which addresses the ways to identify thresholds and cutoffs to support quantification of welfare consequences, we found a few results on literature review and some examples being implemented, such as the welfare quality. We found also a relatively low number of mapped activities compared to the presence of environmental hazards with presence or changes in the quality and proportion of animal-based measures. The species that received the high number of activities were fish, pigs, and poultry. And some of the major gaps found or acknowledged by experts was on the lack of knowledge on inflection points. What is defined to be between good or bad welfare is still lacking. That poses a challenge on data collection to achieve this understanding because of confidentiality issues or because there is a lack of quality and validity of the data. So harmonization of data is necessary. Other knowledge gaps include the need for dynamic thresholds, because animals may have different needs according to their age, husbandry system, etc., and how hazards may affect these thresholds in terms of animal-based measures. So in order to tackle this, the welfare in different situations should be assessed in order to have all the complexity. Next slide. On working area 4, we address the aggregation of individual animal well measures, and a higher number of activities were mapped in this area, reaching 40% of all the activities, including research projects and animal welfare assessment protocols. We found a diversity in the aggregation of methods, indicating a lack of harmonization and standardization on how this should be aggregated. Some examples of aggregation that could be used as a starting point could be the welfare quality or the AWIN protocols. Major knowledge gaps were identified to be the weighting based on scientific knowledge, so experts defining how the different indicators should be aggregated, and some expert opinion on real, therefore measurable experiences. Also, aggregation should be dynamic, because the priorities of animals may change over time depending on their production stages, age, or physiological status. Also, a gap is the basic needs which are excluded from aggregation. These knowledge gaps all refer to a principal challenge, which is gathering traceable and valid welfare data from different life stages. Next slide. On the 5th working area, which is the development of early warning monitoring systems, it was an agreement that precision livestock farming technologies is a subject of many recent studies and research projects, so it's gathering more and more attention. No animal welfare assessment activities included in this category yet. Is perhaps technology is too early to be included in these activities. But PLF are not being frequently implemented nowadays for welfare assessment. Major knowledge gaps spotted by experts included validation of indicators and their thresholds, how the indicators should be included as early warning systems in assessment protocols, and construction of algorithms and feeding the algorithms when referring to PLF technologies. There is a significant lack of coverage in some species, like small ruminants, beef cattle, calves, rabbits, etc. Therefore, more emphasis should be put on these, let's call them small species. Principal challenges include conditions for monitoring are not adaptable to all systems. For instance, some extensive systems may be more difficult to use technology to assess and to implement early warning system, and there is a need to validate technology and to train the users for its assessment. Also, a challenge is data storage, ownership, and costs, which has been also quite homogeneous between experts. Next slide. The 6th working area is the scientific framework for comparison, classification, and grading of farming systems in terms of risk for animal welfare. We found many scientific papers addressing or comparing husbandry systems with respect to the prevalence of major welfare issues. Actually, we found 34% of all MAP activities to be included in these working areas. For instance, all animal welfare assessment activities were included in this working area. More specifically, horses showed the lowest numbers of activities for comparing these systems, so that is a clear gap. Some of the knowledge gaps identified by experts were that aspects included in these frameworks need to be standardized, and prioritization of welfare hazards or risks are still not clear for all species, so farming systems and for some specific welfare aspects. And principal challenges were differences according to sociocultural aspects, beliefs, and priorities. And the welfare requirements from specific frameworks may lead to unwilling secondary welfare issues. And next slide, this is will be the last but not least working area, because this is perhaps one of the most interesting in terms of policy makers and its applicability, refers to supporting the development of frameworks for policy makers, allowing appraisal and comparison of different policy options. We found 23% of all activities in this working area, including the use of iceberg indicators at slaughter, in certification labels, for instance, or 24/7 monitoring systems. Clear gaps can be found for all ruminants except dairy cattle, and also a compilation of what we call minor species that so far received less attention. Knowledge gaps identified by experts were that prioritizing easily measurable and policy relevant indicators, especially beyond slaughter, is essential. So we should make efforts in looking into the farms to start applying these measures. Validation of animal-based measures and comprehensive indicators across different animal categories, and the integration of individual data and that from emerging technologies as well. The principal challenge, perhaps related to all these knowledge gaps, is the use of consistent data, so that needs a standardized collection practices. And with this, I finished the revision of the different working areas, and now I pass the word to Hans, that will talk about the project proposals.
Thank you very much, Paul. Indeed, let me tell you about the recommendations that we have regarding project proposals as an outcome of this activity. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. As Thea already explained at the very beginning, all the work done regarding the working areas and the preceding work when we studied the literature eventually led to inspire us to formulate 10 project proposals, which was subsequently in discussions with EFSA as well as with the experts that joined our project, narrowed down to 5. Now, retrospectively, I think you could say that the main conclusions that are underlying and underpinning these 5 proposals that I will show to you in a minute are, first of all, that more data is needed, that there is a rapid assessment of key indicators that we can use, that should be used, that we need to understand welfare changes over time, welfare needs over time, that there are scientific ways to integrate indicators and determine overall welfare that we are still looking for. And finally, that ultimately we want to move from a reduction of suffering in our overall thinking on animal welfare towards a life worth living for the animals. Now, each of them are associated with one of the project proposals I'll show you in a minute. Can you please click? More data is needed, and we're proposing that we should start a project for harmonized welfare data collection across the EU. For the rapid assessment of key indicators, automated collection of data, particularly on iceberg indicators, would be highly relevant, not just for scientists, also for policy workers. to understand changes over time. The dynamics of welfare over time within species need to be mapped. And we would need expert opinion, and we need minimum values to be able to better integrate and determine overall welfare. And finally, to go from suffering, reducing suffering to a life worth living, we think it's good that we should have more work on positive welfare and the mental state of animals. Now, all of these project ideas are across the species, and I'll now go through them one by one to give you a little bit of information on what such a project could look like. First of all, when you think about harmonized welfare data across the EU, the rationale, of course, is that currently we have insufficient data to be able to compare welfare on our continent, to determine cutoff values for welfare indicators, and ultimately to resolve the occurrence of welfare problems on farms. And it would be good if we could access routinely collected data, because a lot of data is already collected in the dairy farm, in the meat industry, on the farms itself. And if we could have standardized collection protocols, then we could probably collect a lot of additional data on a wide range of farms to form a better picture of what the welfare situation is. So the objectives for a proposal like this, for a project like this, will be, first of all, to identify welfare indicators, facilitate the standardization, to build a platform where stakeholders that collect and that generate these data can join forces and can share. And we are aware that this is not going to be easy, but it's definitely an essential step. Another objective would be to define a methodology of setting selection criteria and select also adequate samples of farms that we need to visit to collect additional data on top of what the platform could already collect. Finally, things like baseline values to do benchmarking, look at the top 25 and the bottom 25% of farms or of indicator values across the EU, and to identify relationships between indicators and delete, therefore, those that are highly correlated. So those are objectives. Now, the way that you could approach it, have the next slide, please, is summarized in the lower of the two boxes, the approach. First, build a network of companies willing to share chain data, then agree with them, but also among scientists, which collection methods should be used, and then start collecting together with these companies the data from the networks. On the way, during the way, identify the missing indicators. What do we not get through this way, but which are essential indicators to make overall welfare conclusions. On the way, we identify them, and then we visit a large number of farms or chain partners to obtain these data. Now, this approach is described in our report, of course, in a lot more detail. And we've also added a suggestion in terms of the ambition level for this and the other project proposal. That's in the top box. We think that a proposal or a project like this would take about 3 years to do. You'd want to visit about 500 farms for species, and you'd spend approximately €1 million per species. Now, of course, there is already an example of such a project in a recently released EFSA call, and you'll find that also, I forgot to say that in the beginning, some of the other project proposals also already have activities which partly overlap with what we're saying. Now, here is a small overlap, and we think it's a good approach and it could be extended to other species. Can I have the next proposal, please? It's on automated collection and assessment of iceberg indicators, and it starts from the rationale that although indicators are single measures, they can provide more information on underlying welfare issues. That's also why they're called icebergs. You see the tip of the iceberg, there's a lot more lying underneath. They allow to substantially speed up a welfare assessment process. You only need to measure the tip of the iceberg, and then you have some idea of what it means for other welfare aspects. And they can provide a first indication of the welfare status. So icebergs can be very relevant, not just for scientists, but also, for example, for labeling schemes or inspectors or for policymakers. Now, to monitor the state of welfare continuously, be it with icebergs or be it with other indicators, it would be very handy if collection could take place routinely, possibly through new technologies that are constantly being developed, such as sensor technology. So the objectives for this project could be to identify iceberg indicators that can be collected continuously in the abattoir, to identify those indicators that can be collected on farm, and then to develop the sensor technology or other technology that allows to collect the information automatically. And finally, an objective would be to set thresholds in discussion with farmers or other chain partners on when an automatically generated indicator would start ringing an alarm bell. Have the next slide, please. In the lower box again, the approach. First of all, collection of data on validity, repeatability, and feasibility can serve as potential indicators, and we have to start collecting that information to then identify what indicators are most useful. The next step would be to develop systems to support monitoring these indicators automatically using sensor technology. Then the collection of these data through the technology in a standardized way, and we would want to do that across a range of different husbandry conditions. Finally, after the data has been collected, we can use artificial intelligence to analyze it, maybe to look for even more and clearer iceberg indicators if that's possible, but also to use it for trial and error threshold setting. In agreement with the end users, we could then determine the alarm levels, the levels at which a bell starts ringing that something needs to happen. In terms of ambition level, we think that for a species you'd need a bit more than €1 million, and it would be it would be about 5 years, we think, for the whole process, including the development of the various technologies that are needed to automatically collect. So we think about 5 years. Proposal 3 is on the dynamics of animal welfare over time. Biological needs of animals change over time, husbandry situations over time. So if you want to have an overall statement, if you want to make an overall statement on what the level of animal welfare has been during the lifetime of the animals, you need to monitor at regular intervals, and probably you have to monitor in very different ways. Also, this is also important, early life experiences, things that happen early on in life, may be very important for later development of the animal, and therefore may also affect what's happening later in life. Well, both are reasons to investigate the dynamics of welfare over time. So the objectives would be to first identify the methodology to score an animal's welfare over time. Different scoring systems, indicators need to be identified. The weighting power, how do these indicators compare to each other, also need to be assessed. Then we would need to know how to weigh different positive and negative experiences. We would want to design production system specific evaluations. So not just during the time, but also the different housing and husbandry systems that apply on a certain moment during its life. And finally, be important to have some understanding of the impacts of early life experiences on coping. Next slide, please. And you'll see the approach. First of all, it's a new area, relatively new area of work. So to develop an overall scientific approach is needed first. Then to identify the indicators that can be used. And then there are 2 ways of collecting the data. One is horizontal, so from different aspects of the life of an animal across farming systems. And the second one is vertical, where you follow an animal or a group of animals throughout its life, and then see how the different welfare aspects relate. Finally, you want to discuss with stakeholders and experts on the relative importance of the indicators that you assess, so that you can have an overall statement over its lifetime. We think between 700,000, maybe 1 million would be relevant, and depending on how detailed you want to investigate the various the various aspects of the lifetime, also depending on the type of animal you look at. Some animals live shorter, obviously, than others. We think between 3.5 and 5.5 years. Can we go to number 4, please? The 4th project proposal is on expert opinion and minimum values. Many welfare relevant indicators still lack threshold values, and how to assess them and also how to weigh one against the other inevitably involves some degree of subjectiveness. You can also call it expert opinion. Care has to be taken while you weight these different indicators against each other, that you do not mask deficiencies, real deficiencies in some of them, when you give more preference to others. So when you balance out how one weighs against the other, you have to guarantee that certain minimum levels still need to be attended to. Otherwise, your balancing act may be correct, but your ultimate welfare outcome may have serious shortcomings. So those two elements should be part of a proposal where an objective could be to develop a set of methodologies that will allow EFSA to apply expert opinion, to aggregate different indicators, and to set the minimum levels that are required for each of these indicators, or for the most important of these indicators. Then to clarify the methodologies, to provide an overview of what methods to set minimum values are already existing, to compare different aggregation methods before you make a general statement, and also, and that's part of this, is to understand how expert opinion works. Can I go to the next slide? As an approach, first of all, understand how expert opinion works. Will different groups of experts, for example, always come up with the same aggregation level? You can also compare different ways of aggregating. You could compare methods whereby a focus group is led by welfare scientists, or if it's led by a farmer or farmer group as mediator, or through a Delphi process, a survey where each person answers independently, and then feedback is provided by other people, and then you relook again at your previous answer to further develop it in an iterative process, or like a Delphi. And of course, different ways to compare different aggregation methods on similar data sets to see if the outcome will always be the same. So you take a data set, a huge big data set, you feed it through different ways of aggregating, and then see what the outcomes will be and if it differs a lot. Timeline could be a relatively short project, maybe a year, and then between 100 and 200,000 euro. Go to the last proposal, please. This is about indicators of positive welfare and mental state. It's difficult to understand how another person feels, never mind how an animal feels. That's almost impossible, and we need to get a better understanding of that. Despite an increase in work in this area, was previously explained in these presentations, definitions are still needed on how to measure it, and also the novel techniques have to be identified on how to measure positive welfare and mental state. So those would be the objectives: to define positive welfare, identify indicators, understand the relationship between positive and negative welfare, determine novel methodologies, but also to explore resilience and adaptation abilities in relation to positive welfare. On the next slide, we propose an approach through a series of studies on experimental farms to investigate how positive animal welfare and mental states are expressed, to do applied research in a commercial setting, to develop reliable assessment of indicators for validity, repeatability, and feasibility under practical circumstances, and then finally to develop consensus among scientists on the working definitions when investigating positive welfare in the future on farms. We expect something like this for each species that is under investigation would be costing about just over €1 million, and probably you'd spend 4 to 5 years of working on these scientific studies and then developing it into practical application. This concludes the set of proposals that we have. Can I have the next slide, please? To harmonize welfare data, automated data collection on iceberg indicators, do something on dynamics of welfare over time, expert opinion and minimum values, and finally to develop indicators of positive welfare and mental state. And we trust that each of these will already contribute to EFSA's overall aims, as was formulated at the beginning of this meeting. And we hope that they can be taken on board in the future to further get away from just mitigating suffering of animals and moving towards a life worth living. And if you want to read the details, you can find them in our roadmap, which will be published as of tomorrow. 16th of January, through Wiley, the online library. And if you really want to dive into the nitty-gritty of all the findings that we have, you can also find the appendices that we've produced on Zenodo in the address that is displayed here.